This episode of Geek's Guide to the Galaxy is brought to you by the new book Spaceman by Mike Massimino. Neil deGrasse Tyson writes, "Every generation of astronauts needs a storyteller, a person with wit, humor, and passion who has lived our collective dreams of space exploration and returned to tell us all about it. Mike Massimino is that person, he's that astronaut, and this is his story. Learn more at MikeMassimino.com.
Wired.com presents The Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. And here is your host, David Barr Kirtley.
Hello, and welcome to episode 224 of Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. Today on the show, we'll be discussing the new anthology, The Best American Science Fiction and Fantasy 2016, and I'm joined by two guests. So first up, we've got our producer, John Joseph Adams. He's the editor of Lightspeed and Nightmare magazines, and he also oversees John Joseph Adams Books, an imprint of Houghton Mifflin Harcourt. He's edited many anthologies, including the recent books The End Has Come, Loosed Upon the World, and Operation Arcana, and he's also the series editor of The Best American Science Fiction and Fantasy. So John, welcome back.
Always good to be here.
And also joining us today is Karen Joy Fowler. She's the author of 7 novels, including Sister Noon, Wit's End, and We Are Completely Beside Ourselves, and 5 short story collections, including Artificial Things, Black Glass, and What I Didn't See, and Other Stories. Her work has received the Nebula Award, the World Fantasy Award, the Shirley Jackson Award, and the Penn Faulkner Award, and has been shortlisted for the Man Booker Prize. Her novel, The Jane Austen Book Club, was adapted into a feature film, and she's also the guest editor for The Best American Science Fiction and Fantasy 2016. So Karen, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much.
And today's show is brought to you by Spaceman, the new memoir by NASA astronaut Mike Massimino. And here's Mike's bio. It says, Mike Massimino served as a NASA astronaut from 1996 to 2014. A veteran of 2 space flights to the Hubble Space Telescope, Mike and his crew set team records for spacewalking time, and he became the first person to tweet from space. He's played himself on the CBS sitcom The Big Bang Theory, was featured in the IMAX film Hubble 3D, and has appeared on talk shows such as The Late Show with David Letterman and Good Morning America. And here's a bit more about the book. It says, in the blue-collar town where Mike grew up, going to college was a big deal, and going to space was unthinkable. He was 6'3", afraid of heights, and, he'll be the first to tell you, never the best athlete or the smartest kid in the class. Even after he propelled himself through Columbia and MIT, earning multiple degrees including a PhD, Massimino was rejected twice by NASA. On the 3rd try, he made it to the final round of astronaut selection, only to be told that his poor eyesight meant he'd never make the cut. But he didn't let that stop him. Mike actually trained his eyes to pass the test. Mike speaks reverently about his time in space, describing the fascinating complexity and paralyzing anxiety of making emergency repairs to the Hubble. How do you remove 111 tiny screws from a machine that was never designed to be fixed, in space, all while worrying that you're about to slip up and inadvertently ruin humankind's chance to discover life on other planets? The book has received a starred review from Kirkus, and physicist Brian Greene writes, Massimino's incredible journeys, filled with grit, courage, suspense, and thrills, are told with such candor and delight that for a brief moment I felt that I'd finally made it to space too. Read this book and be inspired to reach for the impossible. So the book is called Spaceman, an astronaut's unlikely journey to discover the secrets of the universe, and you can learn more at MikeMassimino.com. And now let's get to our panel. Okay, and so we previously discussed the first volume of Best American Science Fiction and Fantasy back in episode 177, so if you're curious about how the series got started, you should definitely go check that out. And now I just want to start off with John and have you just tell us a bit about the response to that first book. Just what sort of an impact would you say that it's had?
Well, we got a lot of great reviews for it, and I've heard from a lot of different individual readers over the course of the year since it came out, who really thought it was great, and it was like something that they were really hungering for. Most of them, I think, have been just sort of general science fiction fantasy readers. I don't know that a lot of the people that I've run into have been sort of the non-genre readers that we're hoping to lure in, but I'm hoping, of course, that a lot of them have found the book and have loved it as well. I haven't noticed that we've actually made that huge of an impact yet overall. I think that's going to sort of accrue over time as more and more volumes come out, because I think the different assortment of writers featured in each book and the different guest editors is going to help us reach different audiences each time. But so far, I would kind of say that I feel like the genre community hasn't fully embraced it yet. Like, I kind of thought that people would be like super excited about it when it came out, and and the sales would be reflective of that. But so far, it's sold well enough, but it hasn't set the world on fire or anything. So I'm hoping that we'll continue to build traction as the series continues on.
Right. So I think it'll probably take 2 or 3 volumes, right, before you've established science fiction's preeminence in the literary world.
Yeah, probably.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, of course, one of the problems with science fiction and fantasy in terms of doing a best of the year volume is that there are several other best of the year volumes, and a new one even just came out like the same year that the first Best American came out. So, there's a lot of competition for best of the year volumes in the genre.
Yeah. Well, you say in your intro that more than one reader review seemed displeased with the proportions of science fiction and fantasy in the 2015 volume. Talk about what kind of grousing did you hear?
Yeah, I mean, this is like on Amazon reviews and stuff like that, like, various amateur reviews. And, it's funny. A bunch of people complained that there was either too much science fiction or too much fantasy, in the book. But then they didn't always agree, which was which. And some of them said that it was all science fiction and they complained about that. And some of them said it was all fantasy and complained about that. So it's just like, it's all very strange how readers, approach a text and they have their different interpretations of like what science fiction is or what fantasy is. Because of that kind of thing, I felt the need to reiterate it in the introduction what I felt like what the definitions of the two genres are, to try to help set some guideposts for people who maybe are coming to the book without having that background in science fiction or fantasy, that we all have. It's always really interesting to see that kind of review. It wouldn't bother me as much if they weren't mad about it because of that. Like if they read the book and they're like, oh, well, I was expecting an equal proportion of science fiction and fantasy, but this was all fantasy, but I loved it. Like if they loved it, it's like, okay, well, I mean, they're wrong about it being, it's like we very explicitly made it half and half, because I wanted each genre to be equally represented in the book. So they make that complaint and then they just grouse about it. So and it's like it makes it seem like it ruined the book for them because like they didn't get enough of both genres. But I'd love to actually be able to hear more from people like that to see like, what do you think the genre boundaries are? Like, what do you think actually makes a science fiction story? Like, I'd love to hear like them explain like how some of those stories in that first volume were science fiction when I said they were fantasy, you know what I mean? So it would be really interesting to have a conversation like that. Unfortunately, can't really engage with reviews online. That's a path to destruction.
Well, yeah, so if anyone's listening to this right now who read the book and wants to fill John in on what you think science fiction and fantasy are, it's johnjosephadams@gmail.com. So,
oh, yeah, thanks.
So go get him. Karen, so just tell us a bit about how did you get involved with this project?
Well, I got involved when John invited me to be the guest editor. I was pretty excited by the first volume myself, and pretty excited about playing a role in the second volume.
Yeah, so tell us a little bit about like what was the process like for you selecting the stories and putting the book together and stuff like that.
I feel that John really did the heavy lifting, as he read, as far as I can see, just about everything, and then winnowed it down considerably so that my job was much easier. I think, was it 80 stories, John, that you passed on?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I read 80 stories, but I read 80 stories that John had already liked. So everything I read was pretty good.
Uh-huh. And so did you have, how did you go about selecting one story versus another for the book?
Of course, in the end, this just comes down to personal taste. I felt that there were a lot of stories in the final 80 that I liked a lot. There were a lot doing something interesting. There were a lot of voices that I found compelling. And in the end, in many ways, the main distinction I found myself making involved the endings of the stories. So there would be stories that I liked equally until I got to the end, and then I would just feel that more than the other, one of them stuck the landing somehow, took me somewhere I didn't expect to go, left me with things vibrating in my brain, something. Often it came down to the endings that I felt were the most interesting and the most successful.
Mhm. Well, yeah, and you also wrote an introduction for this book that I thought was really interesting. And you say that I didn't start reading science fiction until college, taunted into it by the man I later married. I was wondering if you could tell us what that story is.
I can. We had just a couple of dates, and he said, sort of as I remember it, memory being, of course, extremely unreliable in these matters, kind of out of the blue, he said there were a lot of things he liked about me, and he listed some of them. I don't remember what they were. What I remember is the one thing he said he didn't like about me. And the one thing he didn't like about me, he said, was that he could tell, even though we had never had a single conversation on this subject, that I was the kind of snotty reader who thought she didn't like science fiction, even though she had never read any. And I was pretty outraged by this statement, partly because of its accuracy. But I did not want to admit to that, so I told him he was quite mistaken, that I read a lot of science fiction, that I loved science fiction, and then between that conversation and our next date, I went to the bookstore and said, get me some science fiction. I need some science fiction. And the clerks were very excited, and my recollection is that they handed me Dune and The Voyage of the Space Beagle and Canticle for Leibowitz. And I noted that these were all by men, and so with much enthusiasm, they pulled out The Left Hand of Darkness for me as well. And, by the time the third date came around, I was so caught up in those books, I could barely make time to see him again.
I mean, yeah, you say in the intro that the books like The Left Hand of Darkness almost reconfigured your brain.
I think that book in particular did have that effect on a great many people about my age, that sort of in many ways, one of them was just because this was such a different way to think about gender. I'd never thought of books as this sort of thought experiment that you could run and change what was familiar to you into something more imaginative. And that would then, of course, cast back on the world that you lived in interesting ways. So that book just, raised a lot of questions about how gender operates in the world, how it could operate in the world, how it might operate in a different world, in the context of a story that I found extremely moving and compelling. The section towards the end where the two main characters are trekking across the ice together, I still think of as one of the most beautiful set of scenes in any book I've ever read.
Yeah, and you also, in the introduction, you talk about sort of crashing this literature course at Stanford. Could you tell us more about that?
Well, once I started thinking about science fiction, I got pretty fanatical about it. And I was home for the summer. I went to school at Berkeley, but I lived in Palo Alto. My parents lived in Palo Alto. And a friend of mine said that he was taking a fabulous science fiction class from H. Bruce Franklin over at Stanford, and that it was quite a large class and nobody would notice if I just walked in. So he said I should join it. And that's what I did.
Right. It sounds like it was a very political class. It was during the Vietnam War. Do I have that right?
It was during the Vietnam War, yes. It was very political. H. Bruce Franklin was fending off all sorts of threats over his radicalism. The books that I primarily remember from the class were the Russians, whom I had never read before. We read We and the what's it called? The picnic book. the brothers.
The Roadside Picnic by the brothers
Roadside
Strugatsky.
Picnic. Thank you, exactly. It was not an easy class, but it was a pretty fabulous class, and I felt guilty every second because everybody else in the class had paid tuition to take it, and I had not.
Okay, but so you fell in love with all these books and you thought that they were great, but you actually say in the introduction that you think that the golden age of the fantasy and science fiction short story is just about exactly now.
It took me a lot longer to locate the short story market, and because I think it's because it's in the magazines, or maybe just because those original clerks in that original bookstore never handed me collections of short stories. I had no sense of what a lively and contentious little world the science fiction short story community is. But again, once I got there, I loved it, and I love the way stories refer to other stories. It seems like a conversation that's going on that takes place completely in these fictional realms. I think it's easier to accomplish a really shock to the reader in the short form than it is over the course of a novel. And yeah, I think the people that we have currently writing short stories, I would put them up against anybody, anytime, anywhere.
Do you agree with that, John?
Oh, yeah, definitely. I mean, right now, there's probably more places to publish short stories than there has been in a really long time. Like, I mean, I don't know if it's like of all time, but I mean, if you compare the landscape now to like the heyday of short fiction when like in the 50s or whenever it was, whenever the most magazines were out there, I think it's pretty comparable. And of course, now a lot of it is online for free to read. So you're having a lot of readers who are reading short fiction that they wouldn't otherwise because there's no barrier to entry. There's no cost of entry. It's really interesting because of that landscape, with there being so many different editorial voices out there, it's making a really rich landscape of writers, because when you have all those different editorial tastes out there, then it opens up the doors to so many different types of stories to be published. And because of that variety out there right now, I think that's making it all just a really rich harvest for all of us. And one of the things that I've been loving about being the series editor is having the responsibility of having to go out and try to read as much as I can all over the genre, from the big magazines to the small magazines. And it's always really great to find something really terrific in like one of these little tiny magazines that's like in this little, tucked out of the way place that most people probably wouldn't have even noticed. And so it's really interesting to discover that like really good materials even published in things like that, which, like a lot of these small magazines, like they don't really publish, they don't really pay much, if anything. So, it's always really interesting to find good material in such markets. But the fact that all those things exist, I think, is what's making it like this golden age.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you've said that you read about 5,000 stories or so for one of these books, and then narrow it down to 80. Do you have any sort of like rules or approach to winnow it down so dramatically from 5,000 to 80?
Not really. I mean, it's like anybody who has listened to the show before has heard us talk about the slush pile, where it's all the unsolicited submissions that a magazine editor gets. And when you're reading through a slush pile of unpublished material, it's like, you get this sense like right away of whether a story is going to work for you or not. And like you can read just a couple pages or a couple paragraphs even sometimes, depending on what the level of the writer is, and you can just know that it's not for you. And so the same thing happens when you're doing something like Best American, because even though this material is published, you can have widely different tastes between editors. And so like, for instance, there are certain editors I know that like, although a lot of people like what they publish, I don't tend to like them that much. And so I know that like when I'm approaching those, I can expect a certain type of story, which is not to say that I don't give those stories equal consideration. I do. But when I go to start to read any story, I basically think of it just like a slush pile, even though it's all published material, because it's like because the thing is, it's like you're shifting the rating scale. So like with a slush pile, anything that's like really good, like I'm gonna read the whole thing because like maybe I want to publish it. But then for Best American, it doesn't have to, it has to be more than just really good. It has to be like fantastic. So I have to love it. I have to like love it like hardcore, like right from the beginning. And it's like if I start reading the story and I'm not like super in love with it right away, it's like I might as well just cast it aside, because the thing is I got to read through so many different stories. If I'm going to narrow it down to the 80 best, it's like only that's sort of the first bar for entry, is that like, man, I gotta love it right away. So that's one of the ways I sort of discard a bunch of the stories. And then otherwise, it's like, like Karen was saying, it's all about personal taste. In my case, I try to keep in mind who the guest editor is. If once I know who it is, we usually line them up pretty late in the process. So I can try to think like, oh, like, will the guest editor like this one? Like, maybe, like if I'm on the fence about which story to include in my top 80 versus another. But that doesn't play that much of a factor. But that's one of the things that could. And then of course we have all these rules for what material is eligible for Best American. It has to be an American or Canadian publication. The author has to be American or Canadian, or they have to live here. There's all these different rules, and so that eliminates a lot of the stories from consideration as well. But I don't even count those in my tally of like my estimate of 5,000. So.
Yeah. Well, so you were telling me, John, that two of the stories that you liked in particular out of this book were The Heat of Us and Planet Lion. Could you just sort of describe those stories and say why you liked them so much?
Sure. So The Heat of Us by Sam J. Miller is one of the stories I really loved. I thought it was actually probably my favorite story that I read all year. And it was something I was like really jealous that I didn't get to publish first, because, Sam Miller is one of my, authors that I've published a lot in Lightspeed. On the other hand, I can't fill up Best American with all Lightspeed stories. So it's nice when something I love appears somewhere else, But it's a story that reimagines the Stonewall Uprising, and there's like supernatural elements to it and everything. But, it's just like really full of all this great emotion, and it's really brutal. It's got a lot of, really just emotional scenes in there, and it's just written in this really passionate, fiery way that
so to speak.
Yeah, right. That I just really, really loved, and it was just one of those where I read it and I was just like, I was just like furiously turning the pages as I was blowing through it, and I just like I knew it was one of those that was like, oh well, obviously this is going into my top 80, and I was really glad that Karen liked it as well, obviously. So and then the other story was Planet Lion by Catherine M. Valente. And so that one was really interesting too. That was again, like I really loved the language in that, and it was just so strange, and it's about this alien planet, and everything about it is just so unusual. Like I felt like I've never read a story like that before, and it's like, obviously you've read a lot of stories about like alien planets and everything, but this one it just blew my mind, and I do kind of wish that it was called One Lion Called Yttrium, which is like one of the, it's like there's this like refrain throughout the story that's repeated over and over, and I just like, there's something about the way she constructed the language in this story that made me really love it.
Yeah. And so the premise of the story basically is that there is a human warship, and it comes to this alien planet, and the planet is inhabited by these kind of green lion aliens who are telepathic, and they start absorbing the personalities and memories and things of the humans that they come in contact with. And it's very, like the imagery in it is very memorable, and it's just a very like vivid story. And yeah, it is one that really sticks in your head.
It has the prose has a particularly kind of infectious rhythm. So both John and I were agreeing that once we put that story down, we found for a couple of hours that we were thinking to ourselves, and in that rhythm that it was it was hard to shake it off and go back to a normal kind of tone of voice.
Yeah.
Well, so how about you, Karen? Are there any stories that you want to mention just to give people a flavor of what kind of stories they can look forward to in this book?
I really and truly loved them all, and I love several that I couldn't put in the book as well. So it is hard for me to favor one over another in any way. But I will say something about The Great Silence, which is by Ted Chiang, among others. And because I have been involved in the research for my most recent novel in language and in animal issues and animal theory, that story hit me particularly powerfully. I really was the perfect reader for it. I had prepped for about 5 years to read that story, and so when the time came, I thought it was pretty fantastic.
Well, let me just say about that story of The Great Silence, because that was one of my favorites as well. And it's told from the point of view of a parrot who's kind of talking to humanity and wondering, why are we so obsessed with SETI and sending signals out into space looking for aliens who could talk back to us when there are all these animals on Earth, like parrots, who are capable of communication, and we don't seem terribly bothered as a civilization with letting them go extinct. And it's just drawing your attention. So yeah, if we were to discover something comparable to parrots on Europa or something, it would be the biggest thing you can imagine. But people really take all these animals that we share the planet with for granted.
I also really, really love The Game of Smash and Recovery by Kelly Link. I think it's a typical Lake story in that it's full of surprises, sort of moment by moment, line by line, but also then in the twists and turns the plot takes. I think you're set up to believe that there's a brother and a sister abandoned on a planet with a kind of warehouse full of strange artifacts. And then as you go through the story, realize that's not really the situation at all.
Mm-hmm. How about John? Are there any, maybe one or two more stories you want to mention to give people a flavor of the ideas?
Sure. So, one story that I was really excited about was The Dunyazat by Salman Rushdie. I'm not sure if that's actually how you say that word, but that was published in the New Yorker, but so it's always cool when we find something in something like the New Yorker, which doesn't publish a lot of genre fiction, but of course it's also Salman Rushdie. So it's like, that was really cool. And I was glad that we were able to get the story, because I wasn't sure, sometimes when you have like big literary writers like this, they don't necessarily want to be put in a book that's labeled as science fiction or fantasy. But that's a like sort of a romance story about a djinn disguised as a young woman who falls in love with this like real historical philosopher who I think Salman Rushdie said that it's like actually like a distant like ancestor of his or something, because it's like the name of the person is Ibn Rushdie, and it's like R-U-S-H-D, which is not quite how Salman Rushdie's last name is spelled, but it's sort of a version of it.
Yeah, I think if I read the author's note right, his father or grandfather or something changed their family name in honor of that character.
Oh, okay, that's what it was, yeah. But yeah, so that story was really great. I loved, that was again another one that was just like really just wonderfully written. So it's like really the prose that, spoke to me most on that one. And then, sort of on a similar note, also Interesting Facts by Adam Johnson. That one was from Harper's. And again, a big literary writer, who doesn't, isn't typically thought of as a science fiction or fantasy person, although, both of them have actually written, other works that are definitely, of the genre, even if they don't get labeled that way. So that one's sort of this ghost story about a woman who has like this terminal cancer diagnosis, and she sort of starts to feel like a ghost. But then it's like, sort of as you're reading the story, it's like, well, is she a ghost, or is she, does she just feel like one? And so I thought that one was really well done and interesting as well. So those are a couple other ones. I was also really pleased with this Liz Zameska story from Tin House. It's called The Mushroom Queen. It's about this like weird fungus that starts to take over this woman's life. So I thought that one was again really interesting, and it was like I like barely found that one, so I was also really pleased to have discovered it in time that I didn't discover it too late, because it was like one of those things where I had someone at Tin House was sending me some stories, and they sent it to me at the last minute, right before I was sort of had my cutoff point. So I was glad that happened.
Yeah, I love that story. Let me just add one more, which is Headshot by Julian Mortimer Smith. I think just in terms of the um, bravado of the conception was a really memorable story, beautifully accomplished, but also just gives me that shock that I was talking about that science fiction can deliver. And that's a kind of combination of the war on terror and social media and how those two things might interact in the future. It's just amazing, I think, amazingly imaginative.
Yeah, so I also really love that one. So the premise basically is that soldiers in the future have to get approved in real time by what they call a quorum of voters. So average citizens are kind of following them on social media, and the soldier has to request permission to take the shot, and then average citizens sitting at home on their computers have to vote to approve that. And yeah, I thought that was a really interesting idea, and it really makes you think, and I've never seen that idea before. So yeah, I thought that was pretty cool.
I also noticed that Sophia Samatar had 2 stories in volume 1, and so I was very pleased to discover that she was back for us in volume 2, because I think she's a real superstar in my estimation. And
absolutely.
The story that she gave us, Meet Me in a Realm, was just lovely. Just from first word to last word, I thought pitch perfect and very very melancholy, but just very resonant.
Yeah, so actually, so Sophia, Kelly Link, and Sam J. Miller are the only 3 people who have stories in both volumes. So I thought that was worth mentioning, because I think it's really a cool honor, I guess, for them to have managed to do that, to have stories in both volumes, because not only did you have to please me, but then you had to please the different guest editor in each book. So I thought that was cool, but I also like that it's only 3. Like, it's not too much overlap, so that you can have, so we still have a nice diversity of, authors being represented in the book.
Yeah, I will say also that Sam Miller had another couple stories just this year, which could have easily made the book as well. I think he's pretty sensational too.
Yeah, no, he's fantastic, yeah.
I was just going to mention it. When you read all these stories together, there are some interesting synchronicities that pop up. I don't know if you guys noticed. So in the Salman Rushdie story and in this Mushroom Queen story, both of them you can identify the non-human character from a lack of earlobes. I thought that was kind of fun.
I didn't notice that.
Yeah. And then, like the Great Silence you mentioned with the parrot, and then the Mushroom Queen, in the author's note, the author says, my story asks the question, are we smart enough to know how smart fungi are? And I thought it was just interesting that, multiple stories are exploring parrots versus fungi or whatever. Are they smarter than we appreciate?
Mm-hmm.
I'm curious, John, did you interact at all with Salman Rushdie as part of putting this book together?
No. It was just his agent. I emailed his agent to get the permission, and then we actually had to get it from the publisher, from Random House, I think, because this story was first published in the New Yorker, but then he later made it part of his novel that came out last year, I think. I don't remember the date. I don't remember the name of it, but it's like 1001 Nights spelled out in different parlance, like in days and months. Do you know what I'm talking about, Dave?
Yeah. The title of the book, it's a certain number of
right,
years, months, and days. I don't remember exactly, but it adds up to 1001 Nights. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So this story became part of that, and so because of that, Random House, I believe it was, they had the rights to the story, and and Houghton Mifflin actually handles all of the permissions for things, but I had to reach out to like let people know that their story was selected and such, and But with Salman Rushdie, I never heard from him directly. Adam Johnson, I did, who was the other one who I wasn't sure that I would. Everybody else, it was like, I think it was everybody else I knew already or suspected I'd be able to get in touch with them. I guess Liz Zametska I hadn't known before this. Or Dexter Palmer, actually. But I mean, Yeah, I mean, I guess they weren't like these huge like literary icons that I thought were going to be untouchable, you know. So, but Adam Johnson actually did get in touch directly, so that was cool. But Salman Rushdie, I did not though.
Well, let me just reiterate my long-standing invitation to Salman Rushdie to come on this podcast anytime you want. All right, cool. So Karen, in your intro, you say, could it be more clear that the tools of so-called literary realism are no longer up to the task of accurately depicting the world in which we live? Could you talk about that?
Oh my God, do I even have to say it? Look at the presidential election we're living through. It's a statement that is self-evident now on its face, I think. There is nothing real left in the real world.
You also say, I may suspect that they never were, but that's an argument for another time. So, I don't know. I got time right now. So, so why do you think that...
This is just, I may feel that we live in a particularly irrational and hard to believe in sort of world. But, it's the only world I've ever lived in. When I do historical research, when I'm writing historical stories or historical novels, what I tend to discover is that those times were pretty irrational and hard to believe in as well. So I don't want to make the mistake of assuming that the world that I know is harder to believe in than any other world. I feel that would be a form of timeism. Can I make that a word?
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Privileging my own time over somebody else's.
Yeah, I want to say like some sort of chrono-chauvinism or something like that.
Yeah, that works. That works. Well, God forbid that I should be accused of that.
Well, it's interesting, Karen, because speaking of different worlds, you kind of started out in the fantasy and science fiction world and have, made inroads then into the literary realism world. Could you just talk about what was that experience like, going from one, realm into another?
I think that it caused more problems for other people than it did for me. That, I just have always tried to write the story I wanted to write at the time that I wanted to write it, and not worried a whole lot about what you might call it. I've always been extremely grateful that I think the decision of determining what it is I write, what genre, where we're going to slot it, I feel is not really my problem and belongs to somebody else. And along those lines, I would add how grateful I am that John made the decisions about what in the book, in the stories that he passed on to me, which ones were fantasy and which ones were science fiction, because I feel that I have a sort of good grasp on that in the abstract. And then you put an actual story in front of me, and it is not nearly as easy for me to tell one from the other often. So, I know that there has been a certain amount of chatter when I work inside the field of science fiction and fantasy that I'm not actually doing that I'm writing something else that doesn't belong. And when I move outside, I know that it has been problematic for my editor to determine, which part of the bookstore I belong in and where my proper shelf is. So again, I can see that there are problems involved because of where I live and who I run around with. It's just not something that I've given a whole lot of consideration to myself.
Do you ever run into people face to face who make snide comments or anything, or is this mostly sort of an internet thing?
Well, there's a lot of it on the internet for sure, but yeah, mostly I don't know if you'd call it a snide comment, although it could be. But I frequently meet people who ask me if I think I write science fiction. and I tend to try to determine based on where I am and how they phrase the question and what my assumptions about them are to try to give them the answer that will irritate them the most.
I was going to say, I mean, speaking of the two worlds that sort of Karen has inhabited in the literary sphere, I mean, that's obviously one of the reasons that she seemed perfect for to be guest editor this year. Because we want to try to reach out to that literary readership to try to get them to convince them to read science fiction and fantasy, give it a shot. But then at the same time, we also want the genre readers to know that their book, that their this book that's proclaiming the best of the year is in good hands, and so Karen's great because she satisfies both of those requirements like fantastically, because like obviously she's very well respected in the literary world, and then in science fiction it's like, well, she came from here, and it's like she still works with the Clarion Foundation, and so it's like she's got sufficient credibility in both camps to make her a perfect selection. And I really enjoyed the whole process. Like, you never know when you go into any kind of collaboration what it's going to end up like. But it seemed like we had really good similar tastes. It's like we didn't have any clashes or anything, and so I thought it worked out great.
I thought so too. I know there was at least one story that I think you would have liked me to include, and possibly more than one, but I've got one in mind in particular. But in general, we were pretty much in agreement.
Yeah, and I mean that's always going to happen. I think where like I'll fixate on some favorite and doesn't necessarily resonate for the guest editor. So, but I mean I think that's fine. Like I said, a lot of my favorites did end up in here on the top 10 or on the top 20. So I mean I can't complain. Yeah, the thing is, it's like I also have Lightspeed and Nightmare, so if something doesn't make it into Best American, I can always end up reprinting it in one of them, and still put my stamp on it.
Absolutely, and so you should.
So Karen, so you also say in your intro that the future of warfare was by far the most common theme, both in the stories I chose and in the ones I wished for but could not take. Could you just talk about how is warfare kind of echoing through fantasy and science fiction right now?
I guess I'll start that answer by talking about something that surprised me, which was that I thought the kind of current war on terror would be more prominent, and yet what I felt that I found more often was an older version of war, more of a less of a lone wolf actors, less incidents, and more one army against another army. Which I guess I'm saying that's old because I so wish it would go out of style. I'm ready. I'm ready to be done with both of them. But so that's what I found more often was soldiers and stories about soldiers.
And so why do you think that warfare is so on people's minds right now?
I would have to see if it had ever been off people's minds. I wonder if there are years in which it does not dominate. One of the things that disturbs me is that it is such a powerful narrative, and it's a narrative that people really respond to, that has a great hold on us. So, even when we, in popular culture, when we go out into space, it's still Star Wars. It's still the battles that we're looking at, I don't think it's a helpful narrative. I don't think it's a narrative that, again, I did all this research to write my most recent novel, so it looks to me more like sort of a primate narrative. I would like to evolve past it, but it does, it's clearly something that has enormous power. The potential for moments of heroism in the midst of horror is something that seems to be kind of evergreen in its appeal to us.
Yeah. So, I mean, how about John? Was the warfare, was that something that really stood out to you, or were there other themes that you noticed in all the stories you were reading?
I hadn't picked up on the warfare thing. I think probably because, as Karen sort of wondered, like I don't know that it ever is not on the mind of writers. It seems like that's just sort of a thing in the genre that you see pretty much all the time, at least as far as I can remember. And, there's always a good amount of stories that deal with it in some fashion or another. And, I was a judge for the National Book Award last year, and it's like, and same thing happens in that field as well. And like, so much was focused on it that it was kind of surprising for young adult literature. But, I think it's just something that's like inherent to humanity, that we've had to deal with so many wars over the years, and there's always some war going on somewhere or another in the world. And, that I think it's just sort of something that we can't avoid but to write about, because it is such a fraught experience, for anyone who's touched by it. And as a writer, if you're grasping around for some sort of conflict, obviously there's all this inherent conflict built into anything to do with war. But let's see. Otherwise, I'm not sure that any other huge themes like stood out to me as like being particularly common. Unfortunately, it's like, of course, we're doing this now after I've already spent the whole year reading, thousands of other stories that were published in 2016, and also reading a bunch of novels now. So it's like the 80 stories that we ended up with on the long list are not as fresh in my mind as they might have been. But yeah, I mean, nothing really jumps out at me as a pervading theme otherwise.
All right, well, let us know, John, if you think there were a lot of stories about ferrets or something this year.
Yeah.
I mean, Karen, you also said that another theme that you had noticed was where and when does our empathy run out? Could you talk about that?
Wow, give me a second. I don't remember saying that. Wonder which stories I was thinking of in particular.
I mean, I could say, I mean, the story that was really the standout story for me in this book was called Three Bodies at Mitanni by Seth Dickinson. I thought it was just a tremendous...
Of course. That's a story that is focused very much on that exact issue. So why don't you talk about that one? Why did you like it so much?
I just thought it did everything that I want a science fiction story to do. It had... just conceptually, it was really interesting. There was an incredibly interesting ethical dilemma at the heart of it. The science was really interesting in terms of, Seth he was in a PhD program in psychology, and he really knows a lot about the brain and psychology and how all that stuff works. And the characters I thought were very memorable, and it just all the stories I read, I sort of underline things that I think are interesting that I might want to come back to later, or that I might want to think about more. And with that story, I was just underlining it. Like pretty much the whole story is underlined. I mean, it was just so many fascinating things going on in it. And then the ending too was it was surprising yet inevitable. I mean, everything you want the ending of a story to be. I really thought it was one of my favorite stories that I've ever read.
Oh wow!
And no, I was just blown away by it. But yeah, and it does speak very directly to what you were saying about. I guess I'll say the premise of it is that there's a human spaceship, and their job is to travel around to different colony worlds that have been seeded by seed ships and check in on these colony worlds and destroy them if they seem to potentially pose a threat to Earth. And so they find a world where it was supposed to be a habitable world, but it turned out to be a basically uninhabitable world. But the seed ship colonists have managed to survive on it by genetically engineering themselves not to have consciousness, because consciousness is something, it's just like something you can't afford to have in that dire of circumstances, because it's just sort of a distraction. And so they project that these genetically engineered people with no consciousness are so capable and competitive that they're guaranteed to subsume normal humans given enough time. And so the question is, are they justified in destroying them? What's the value of life without consciousness? And I don't, just all sorts of really interesting ethical dilemmas like that come out of it. But I don't know, Karen, is there anything you wanted to add about that story?
Um, no, I think I think it was the ethical dilemma probably that appealed to me the most. The decision that this threesome on the starship must make about whether this new evolutionary strategy is something that can be contained or has to be destroyed. I guess I'm still thinking about the empathy issue. Again, this was something I was very focused on in my last novel, so I'm primed to be noticing it. But I guess I would say that it's clearly there in The Heat of Us. It's certainly there in The Great Silence. This idea of how far empathy can be extended, or will be extended. I'm trying to think of others. Maybe Ratcatcher's Yellows by Charlie Jane Anders as well.
Yeah, I guess I'll just say one more thing about Three Bodies at Mittani that occurs to me is that one of the people on the ship argues, like basically the issue is we could wipe out these people without consciousness, but then what if they're fit to survive in the universe and we're not? Would it be better to have no life at all, no human life at all in the universe, or wouldn't it be better to have human life with no consciousness? And but would it actually be? I mean, that's a really interesting question. I don't know. I just love that story. But I don't know, John, do you have anything you want to say about empathy or any of the things we've been talking about?
I didn't want to really add anything about that particular, but I was going to say about Three Bodies at Mittani. One thing that I really was pleased with is that that's like such a core hard SF story. I mean, it appeared in Analog originally, so it's like just the fact that it was that we found a story in Analog that was cool that ended up in the book, because like with this book being so geared towards sort of like literary crossover, I'm really glad anytime we can find something that does meet all those, like push all those buttons, like you were saying, David. It's like, oh, this is like everything that in a science fiction story that you want, right? And so it's like, yeah, it's like that's the kind of thing that I grew up reading that like I would always be looking for. The fact that that it was published and I found it and liked it, and then Karen also liked it and we have it in the book. I think that's cool, because I would love to see what a literary reader who sort of stumbles upon this book because of the Best American brand, I would love to see what they think of that story, because I was imagining, like when Karen was talking about The Left Hand of Darkness, like you can imagine someone picking up that book and that being like, I mean, especially back in the 70s or 80s or whatever, it's like you can imagine someone picking up that book and it's like that literally being the first time they've ever encountered the concept of a non-binary gender, and that kind of thing. And it's like, can you imagine like how much your mind is blown by encountering concepts like that? And so like, I think like a literary reader who comes to a book like this and you just encounter something like Three Bodies in Mittani, I kind of wonder what that will do to their brain. I mean, not that it's necessarily on the same level as Left Hand of Darkness, but, I kind of wonder what that will do to such readers.
Yeah. If anyone out there has any literary readers, give them that story. I'd be curious to know what they think of it.
I will say about empathy. You guys mentioned Ratcatcher's Yellows by Charlie Jane Anders, and I really love that story as well. I mean, I originally published it. Also, it was in Press Start to Play, my video game anthology, and of course, I had a grandparent. My grandfather had dementia, and the story sort of deals with dementia. It's like a video game is created that it allows people with dementia to sort of try to make some quality of life improvements via the video game, I love reading stories that deal with that sort of subject matter that can try to imagine some procedures or methods or whatever that can help people with dementia, because having taken, like I not only had my grandfather who had dementia, but I mean, like I actually lived with him and took care of him for several years, so I got to see it up close and personal. So obviously the empathy in that story really resonated with me.
Could you guys talk about, did any of the author's notes strike you? Because I thought there was some pretty interesting stuff in the author's notes. I mean, one thing that really jumped out at me is Maria Devana Headley talks about getting this 8-foot long taxidermied crocodile in her author's note. I don't know. Do you know her, John? Have you ever heard of this taxidermied crocodile in her New York City apartment?
Yeah. I mean, I've only met her a couple times in person, but I mean, I've published a ton of her stories, and I follow her on Twitter. So I saw her talking about the crocodile thing on Twitter when she got it or whatever. So I remembered that, but I think it's funny that it ended up like inspiring stories, and to the extent that she's talking about it in her author's note or whatever. But I don't know much about it otherwise. But I mean, whatever it says in the author's note is probably the extent of my knowledge. But I thought.
Did you have any responses though, as the author's notes were coming in? Did you think any of them were like, "Oh, that's interesting," or "That's weird," or anything like that? I guess it was a while ago now.
Yeah. I mean, they're not really fresh in my mind. I thought it was interesting. Adam Johnson didn't want to say anything. Like he didn't want to comment on the story at all. And I think it was like a really personal story for him. So I sort of suspect that that's why he didn't want to say anything. But so I mean, that one, by the virtue of the fact that he had literally said nothing, I thought was kind of interesting. But I mean, I think they were all generally interesting in one way or another. But I wouldn't have said that anything really jumped out at me in particular.
I thought it was interesting in that story where it's about an author who's mobbed by attractive young women after winning a Pulitzer. And then I read his bio and it said he won a Pulitzer. So
yeah. Well, I think I think his wife like literally did have cancer, so it's a very like autobiographical story, except for the ghost part, I guess. I think that's why he didn't want to say anything, because it was so personal.
Yeah.
But
Karen, did any of the author's notes or anything about the sort of stuff around any of the stories?
I haven't seen the author's notes. Can't answer that question.
Yeah, so I guess she hasn't gotten her contributor copy yet, and there's no reason that she would have seen them ahead of time, because that all goes through me. I will say, as far as sort of extraneous material, like, so like the author's notes in the back, and there's also the notable stories list, which is the 60 stories that didn't make it into the book. So, I give Karen 80 stories and she picks the best 20, and then the rest of the remaining 60 stories are listed in the back of the book as the notable stories of 2015. And so I just wanted to say, like, I was really speaking of Maria Devana Headley, I was really glad she ended up in the book this time, because I think she actually has the most stories listed in the notable stories between the two volumes. I think she had 4 stories in the notable story list this year, and then she had a bunch last year too. So, I'm a huge fan of hers. I published a ton of her fiction, but then also just, the stuff that she publishes elsewhere is usually great too. So, I was really glad to see her represented after, so it's kind of like the Susan Lucci of American science fiction and fantasy. It's like, oh, you finally got a story in there. I mean, admittedly, there's only 2 volumes so far, but still, it's a lot of near misses that she had there.
Well, she's 13 Mercies, right?
Yeah.
The 13, yeah. I thought that was an amazing story. Well deserved. Her place in the book is well deserved.
I guess one other thing I wanted to ask you about, Karen, is you say in your intro that it was your uncle, right? He says, "I never want my mind overwhelmed with someone else's minds." Could you tell that story?
Yes. Well, this is an uncle I hadn't heard from for quite a while. He and my aunt actually divorced many years ago, so he kind of has not been really part of my life. For many years, really, the whole time I've been a publishing writer, I've not heard from him or much about him. But with the last novel I published, he wrote me a letter, and just to talk about the novel and how he felt about it and what he'd seen, but it contained to me this very peculiar kind of position that he said in general he doesn't read novels because he doesn't want to have his mind overwhelmed by somebody else's mind. And I was just so struck by that statement, because I thought, and that's the part I like the best. That's the whole point, is that you get to sink into somebody else's mind. I think it also, is one of the reasons that I love fantasy and science fiction, is that I'm so aware of someone else's mind when I'm reading them. When it's a realist story, you can focus on the characters and you can focus on the situation and you can follow what's happening to them. But when it's a science fiction or a fantasy story, the author is bringing so much imagination and, taking you someplace absolutely unfamiliar. And so that sense of seeing the world the way somebody else sees it, and seeing the possibilities that somebody else imagines is, it's just thrown into higher relief for me. And it's one of the things that I love, that I am just so firmly in somebody else's imagination, seeing things and thinking things I would never have been able to come up with for myself.
Well, and speaking of empathy, right, there's been all this research that's come out recently saying that reading fiction increases your empathy.
Yes, I think, I have come to believe very strongly that is the whole project of literature, is to expand our empathy beyond people we see as like ourselves, where it's very easy to be empathetic, into realms where we're dealing with people whose ways of thinking and ways of behaving are less familiar to us and therefore less easy to understand. That books are the way that you learn to care about people and things and creatures who are not like you.
Yeah, and parrots and fungus and...
Absolutely. Fungus are very smart, incidentally. I will just say that. As a system, they're a very smart system.
Well, right, she says in the book about that they can solve mazes and things like that.
Yes.
Yeah, I don't know any. I'm curious. I didn't know that, so I'll have to look up more about that. I also wanted to ask you, Karen, I just watched the Jane Austen book club this afternoon, and I appreciated the fact that the Hugh Dancy character is always trying to get Maria Bello to read Ursula K. Le Guin. I was wondering do you think a lot of people watch that movie and go check out Ursula K. Le Guin?
I would love to think so. I've got no evidence one way or the other, except that I do know that Hugh Dancy himself began reading Ursula Le Guin when he was playing that part.
Oh,
so
great.
I'm settling for that. That's good enough.
Speaking of Jane Austen Book Club, there was one story that we couldn't actually consider this year because the author was not American, but I published a story in Lightspeed called the Karen Joy Fowler Book Club.
Oh,
so
yeah.
I just thought that was amusing because earlier you were talking about how you enjoy how stories like comment on each other and that kind of thing, and so it's like okay, well, there's a case of actually commenting on your story and you at the same time.
It was thrilling. I love that story.
Yeah. Oh, I'm glad you liked it. Unfortunately the author is Australian, so we couldn't consider her for this, but I think it did get reprinted in a different year's best, so that was nice.
I also just wanted to mention one of the stories that I really liked in here was called Lightning Jack's Last Ride by Dale Bailey. But there's a line in here, John, I think might cause you some trouble. He mentions how this post-apocalyptic world was created by the NRA blowing up DC with a dirty bomb. I suspect you might be getting some angry letters about that.
Yeah, perhaps. That's funny. That story, like I also love that story, and that was one of those where I actually like remember the experience of reading it. Maybe it's just because I was sort of reading it in a weird way, but I was actually playing the video game Skyrim, and the load times when you go between zones was so long that I was like getting so bored that I was like, okay, well, I might as well like do some reading while I'm doing that. And so I actually like read that story like in between zoning and during the game. And it's kind of a sad state of affairs that the zoning takes so long that I can actually make some progress reading a story in the time I have to wait. But
no, that's a good thing. We need more zoning time in video games to get people to read more.
Right. Well, it would have been more perfect if I was playing Fallout, because that story is like, that would have made more sense with that story. But Skyrim is what I was playing, so.
All right, cool. So we're pretty much out of time. I did want to ask you, John. You mentioned last time we talked to you that you had gotten a contract for 2 of these Best American Science Fiction and Fantasy volumes.
Yep.
What's the future of this series looking like right now?
Yeah, so we initially did 2 volumes in the first contract, and then we did sign a new contract to have volumes 3 and 4. So it's definitely going to exist until volumes 3 and 4. So that's the 2017 and 2018 volumes. And then we'll wait and see what happens after that. I expect it'll keep going. I mean, it seems like HMH is really behind it, and we're doing pretty well so far. Obviously, we'll see more after this volume comes out and see how it does. But we just lined up our guest editors for 2017 and 2018. I can't actually announce who they are yet because we haven't. We haven't made that announcement yet, but we did just line them up. So I'm very excited about that. And I was actually also really excited that we were able to line up the 2018 person now, because usually HMH waits until very late in the year. Like I don't remember when we lined you up, Karen, but we were just lining up the 2017 one like this or in September, and so usually it's kind of at the last minute, and I was finally like, hey guys, you know what? It's like we want to get these like big fancy people to be guest editor. It's like they need more time to make this decision. It's reading 80 stories and writing an introduction, but I mean, these people are busy. They have lots of things to do. Like, can we get a little bit more lead time? So, I think people will be very excited when we do announce who they are. I'm pretty excited about it. So,
I'm just warning you that we're going to be having dinner together in a couple of days before we do the Kepler's event, and I'm going to be plying you with wine. And, by the end of the evening, I'm going to expect to know the names of these editors.
Yeah, John, you can just tell us. No one listens to this podcast anyway.
Yeah, right. Well, the joke's on you though, because I don't actually drink, so that doesn't work on me.
All right, I'll be plying me with wine then.
Yeah, I might be able to whisper it to you on the with secrecy, with sworn secrecy, but I can't announce it on the podcast at last.
All right, cool. Yeah, so I think we're pretty much out of time. So I don't know, Karen, do you have any final thoughts? Anything else you wanted to mention?
Just really enjoyed the whole process, and again, I think the stories in the collection are incredible, each and every one of them. So I hope it finds an audience that feels the same.
And John, final thoughts?
I'll just add that if anybody wants to learn more about it, you can just go to johnjosephadams.com/best-American, and you can, see all the table of contents for both volumes. You can learn about the different authors. You can see, you can read the introductions to both volumes and stuff like that. So you can take a look. And it also has links to where you can buy the different volumes.
All right, great. So we've been speaking with John Joseph Adams and Karen Joy Fowler. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, David.
Thank you.
And that was our panel. So big thanks again to John Joseph Adams and Karen Joy Fowler for joining us on the show. Big thanks as well to Penguin Random House for sponsoring today's show. Check out the new book Spaceman, an astronaut's unlikely journey to unlock the secrets of the universe over at MikeMassimino.com. And remember that Geek's Guide to the Galaxy is made possible thanks to support from listeners like you. So if you enjoy the show and want it to continue, please sign up to give us $1 or $2 per episode over at patreon.com/geeks. And if you'd rather make a one-time or fixed monthly contribution, you can do that via PayPal over at geeksguideshow.com/crowdfunding. So big thanks again to everyone who's contributed. We really appreciate it. All right, so that was our show. So thanks everyone for listening, and we'll see you next time.
Wired.com presents The Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. And here is your host, David Barr Kirtley.